With the NFL draft over, it is time to take a look at our updated 2024 wide receiver rankings and tiers as we enter the summer months. So let's kick things off with the top 4 players, all making up tier 1 in my personal order of Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Ja'Marr Chase, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I honestly don't think that we really need to spend much time here on these 4. They're all elite, young wide receivers who each have commanded huge target shares upwards of nearly 30% in a single season. They've all posted massive individual seasons with 18.5 plus PPR points per game, and there's really no reason that any of this should stop for the next several years or so. So they are all deserving of being in tier 1. Honestly, the one player who might not be 100% deserving or may fall out of the top tier this time next year is actually Ja'Marr Chase, who is still holding on to his elite rookie season and being tied to Joe Burrow, but a combination of health issues for both Chase and Burrow have led to quote-unquote underwhelming seasons in back-to-back years that if he has another good but not elite year, he could fall out of this group, but the talent is still just so blatantly obvious that he needs to be in this tier. Now, the next 2 players I really don't have the heart to call tier 2 guys, but I also think that there are small factors at play that keep them out of tier 1, and that's Marvin Harrison Jr. and Puka Nacua, making up what I'm just going to call tier 1B. We'll start with Marvin Harrison because his reasoning for not being in tier 1 already is just very simple. We have not seen him play in the NFL yet. And I know that's such a cop-out reason, and I'm sure by the end of October, he's going to be in tier 1, but as of right now, in June 2024, there is still a possibility that Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't fully translate to the NFL or even isn't the elite wide receiver prospect that we all think that he is. There is a world where he's just Amari Cooper or just DJ Moore to start his career, and that's still fantastic, but it's just not Marvin Harrison Jr. And God forbid that he turns into Corey Davis or N'Keal Harry. That is just absolute worst case scenario. So because we haven't seen him in the NFL yet, I can't put him up with Amon-Ra, Chase, Lamb, these guys that are just killing it on an elite level year after year already and have been doing so for multiple years. And that brings us to Puka Nacua, and the reason that I don't have him in tier 1 is because we haven't seen it for multiple years, and his pedigree still does not bring me the confidence to put him in tier 1 without those multiple years of production like it would for Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, by the end of October, this could be a really silly caveat as Puka is more than likely an elite receiver in the NFL. You don't have a rookie season like he had if you are not an elite receiver in the NFL, but there is still something just in the back of my head holding me back when I think about his day 3 draft capital or his aging quarterback situation or all the other factors at play that come in for Puka Nacua that is still preventing me from putting him up in tier 1, but as for right now, he's going to sit here in tier 1B with Marvin Harrison Jr. Tier 2 now is another relatively simple tier of just 3 players, starting off with A.J. Brown, who has a very easy argument here. He's coming off of 2 monstrous seasons since joining the Eagles, back-to-back 1,400-yard years with 18 total touchdowns combined over those 2 seasons. He is a monster. He's a true alpha wide receiver in the NFL. He is just absolutely amazing. The only thing holding him back from being in tier 1 or even in tier 1B is just straight up age, as he's the oldest receiver that we've talked about so far, and actually the second oldest in my entire top 16 as he turns 27 at the end of June. Now, it is weird to call a 27-year-old human being old, but that's the NFL and that's Dynasty, and every year from now until he retires is going to involve an age argument that's going to knock his value down year by year. But for now, he's still very much elite. He still has a lot left in the tank in a very fantastic situation. So he's my wide receiver 7 here at the top of tier 2. Then we have Garrett Wilson next on the list as the young elite talent at the receiver position, but we're just waiting for that massive breakout season, which I hope is coming in 2024 with a fully healthy Aaron Rodgers, because that is really all Garrett Wilson needs is just an actually competent quarterback. I actually just saw a tweet from Graham Barfield saying that Garrett Wilson was 5th among all receivers last year in expected fantasy points per game, tied with DeVonta Adams and ahead of Puka Nacua and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yet Wilson saw the 3rd most uncatchable targets last year and averaged 3 to 5 fantasy points per game less than those other 3 last year. So hopefully 2024 is the year with Aaron Rodgers, and that hope is what is keeping Wilson here at wide receiver 8. And the 3rd and final player in tier 2 is the rookie Malik Nabers, the stud wide receiver drafted 6th overall to the New York Giants. To me, Nabers right now is Garrett Wilson just 2 years ago. That has been my NFL production comp for Malik Nabers Nabers since he was drafted by the New York Giants. An uber talented player, probably going to see a massive amount of targets because there's really nobody else on the team to throw to, but because the offense and the quarterback play in general is just subpar, his production is probably going to be hindered by the poor offense, so he may not have a big breakout year for a year or two when the situation does change. I will say though, in Nabers' defense, I do think he's a slightly better receiver than Garrett Wilson, and I also 100% know that Daniel Jones is a better quarterback than Zach Wilson or anybody else that has thrown passes to Garrett Wilson in New York. So maybe Nabers has potential for a top 20 or top 15 production, whereas Wilson so far has been outside the top 20. Now to round out my top 10, we have Tyreek Hill, a player that I have a massive amount of trouble ranking because he feels like such a unicorn right now in Dynasty, given his massive production as the wide receiver 2 overall in both 2022 and 2023, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game in both seasons. But he is also 30 years old and has openly talked about retiring at the end of 2025. So he is literally only valuable to a handful of teams in every single league, and it's so hard to compare him and rank him amongst other players because he most likely outscores everybody else that you compare him to, but is also much older than everybody else that you compare him to. So I just have him here at wide receiver 10, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Puka. He is not a tier 3 wide receiver, but he's not tier 2, so he's just in tier 2B as this older, soon to be retired, yet insanely productive player that will most likely ride into the sunset on every single roster he's on right now. All right, tier 3 is another small tier of just 3 players, all of whom I have great confidence in as my wide receiver 2, but all could be borderline wide receiver 1s in fantasy production. Starting first with Drake London, the alpha wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons, who now finally gets a quarterback upgrade and a coaching staff upgrade with the removal of Arthur Smith. This honestly feels a lot like my hope for Garrett Wilson, and there really isn't much difference to me between the two in my confidence level for massive year 3 breakouts for both guys. The reason why Wilson is still up in tier 2 and London is down in tier 3 is because we have mostly seen it already from Garrett Wilson. We have back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, an absolute massive amount of targets for Garrett Wilson, 315 total already through 2 years. That is absolutely insane, the amount of volume that Garrett Wilson has had. And all of that is in as bad, if not worse, of a situation than Drake London has had for the past 2 years. London has all the advanced metrics in his favor, all the analytics, even the tape looks fantastic. But like I said, we just really haven't even seen a really good season from Drake London like we have with Garrett Wilson. London's career high in targets is 117. His career high in yards is 905. He has 6 total touchdowns in just 33 games played. His situation was horrible, absolutely, but he is the one who has to make a bigger leap to a breakout season statistically than Garrett Wilson. So that's why Wilson's in the top 10 and London is just outside looking in. But I do have a lot of confidence that 2024 is the year for Drake London, which is why he's here at wide receiver 11. Now, the next 2 players I'm just going to group together here in tier 3 because they're very, very similar. It's Brandon Aiyuk and Jaylen Waddle, both players who have the ability to be NFL wide receiver 1s, but due to their situations have had to play more as wide receiver 2s on lower volume and thrive on efficiency. Over the last 3 seasons, both players have had back-to-back top 15 seasons and then one wide receiver 3 season where the efficiency or volume just really wasn't there. For Waddle, that season was last year after 2 straight top 15 years, and for Aiyuk, his bad year was in 2021 as he's coming off of 2 straight top 15 seasons. Both receivers we know are immensely talented, both can have monster 30-plus point games any given week, but they can also have 5-point games where their offense just flows through somebody else and it doesn't go through them. So that is kind of the game and the roller coaster that you have to play with both Brandon Aiyuk and Jaylen Waddle. Fortunately, there are past the changing situations in the very near future. For Aiyuk, that could be a trade during the season to open up his target share, or for Waddle, it's waiting out Tyreek for 2 more years. Either way, these guys are great to have on your roster, and for me, round out tier 3 and essentially my incomplete dynasty wide receiver 1s. Now, tier 4 is where things start to get fun, but also extremely complicated because there really isn't that much difference between a lot of guys in this range. They're all basically the same age and basically the same situations with basically the same production. It's really just who do you prefer out of this entire group. So I have 8 total names that make up my tier 4, and if you have them in a different order than me, that is totally fine because again, they're all pretty much the same. So the order for me goes Chris Olave, Nico Collins, Michael Pittman, DJ Moore, Odunze, DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, and DeVonta Smith. So let's quickly give some bullet points for each player and talk about why they're ranked where they are and why I have them above some other players. First up is Chris Olave. He's the second youngest of this group, and to me is a balance between what we want him to become and what his offensive situation will allow him to become. Because right now, we know Chris Olave is a fantastic wide receiver. He's clearly a top talent in the league, but his quarterback is Derek Carr for probably another 2 to 3 years given his contract, and I just do not have confidence that Olave breaks out in this current situation, and I fear he's one more fantasy season away from just being like Terry McLaurin or something like that. But again, the upside is there, the talent is there, the age is there as well too, so that is all keeping Chris Olave up at this position in hopes that he does find a breakout season. Nico Collins is up next. He had a fantastic year 3 breakout, and I think his season is still pretty underrated based on his yards and targets per route run, and just how he wins as a wide receiver. Obviously, being tied to CJ Stroud doesn't hurt at all, so hopefully Collins can further cement himself as the wide receiver 1 on this offense in 2024, and if he does that this year, playing alongside Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell, then he probably has to be a top 10 receiver this time next year. And also, as I'm recording this, Nico Collins just signed a new 3-year deal with the Texans, so that improves my overall confidence in him long-term as well. Up next is Michael Pittman, who we know is great. He just continues to get better every single year. The question is really, can Anthony Richardson continue supporting him as that high-end wide receiver 2 or low-end wide receiver 1? That I'm not necessarily sure on. It looked solid when Richardson was healthy to start the year last year, but it's really hard to predict that over an entire season based on really just 2 games played. Plus, the Colts did add Adonai Mitchell as a more X-style receiver, so what is this offense? What is Michael Pittman? I don't really know until we see it, but I do trust Shane Steichen, and I do trust Michael Pittman himself, so that's what lends himself to being ranked here this high. Now, DJ Moore is basically a combination of the last 2 arguments because there are now a ton of mouths to feed in Chicago, and we have a new quarterback who I believe should be great, but will he actually be great? How long does it take him to be great? Not necessarily sure. Not to mention that DJ Moore is now the second oldest receiver that we've talked about so far, older than AJ Brown, so that age factor is creeping up on him for his dynasty value too. I really like DJ Moore, but I just don't really love DJ Moore because so much has happened in Chicago that I want to believe is all good, but it might not be, or it might not be immediately. But that leads us to Rome Odunze, basically the other side of the coin for DJ Moore. Odunze is pretty much by far the youngest receiver in this entire tier, and if you want to talk about long-term upside over the next like 3 to 5 years, I think that argument also goes to Rome Odunze. Keenan Allen's a free agent at the end of the year. DJ Moore turns 28 next year, so all we need is the connection between Caleb and Rome to sync up, and we could have ourselves like a Roddy White, Julio Jones thing going on where the torch gets passed down to the younger guy and everything is completely copacetic. Now, DK Metcalf, I really want him to be higher, but again, it's just hard to given the offensive situation. All the mouths to feed in Seattle, the kind of average quarterback play from Geno Smith, it's all just really solid, but not overly great. I am hopeful that this new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, can elevate the passing game to a point that we haven't seen in Seattle since prime Russell Wilson, maybe even more, honestly, with just sheer volume that we haven't seen in Seattle, so that can raise up Metcalf's numbers back to 2020 form when he was a fantasy wide receiver 1, and that hope and that upside is what's keeping DK Metcalf here, but I do really wish that I can put him higher. I just can't really feel like I can. Now, T. Higgins is kind of in the same boat. We know that he himself is a really good wide receiver, but he's hindered by being the number 2 on the offense, and now the Bengals have lost their pass-happy offensive coordinator, so what does a new offense bring to Cincinnati that could be better than what they've had since Higgins entered the league in 2020? The one positive is that Higgins is most likely on a new team in 2025, if not potentially even by the end of 2024, so there could be positive value change from that, even if the situation isn't necessarily a complete upgrade than being the wide receiver 2 in Cincinnati for Joe Burrow. And lastly in this tier, we have DeVonta Smith, another great wide receiver, held back by being the wide receiver 2 on his own team behind an alpha wide receiver 1. The main difference between Smith and Higgins, though, is Higgins has a more immediate out of his situation than DeVonta Smith. Smith is quote-unquote stuck in Philadelphia for at least 2 more years with his 5th-year option, maybe even 3 if he does get franchise tagged in 2026. So 3 more years potentially of just good but never really elite fantasy numbers, which is definitely fine. It's more than fine even, but just not really a difference maker in terms of production and not different than a bunch of names that we've already mentioned or have yet to even mention later in these rankings. All right, tier 5 now is going to take us through the rest of my top 25, starting with Tank Dell, the youngest receiver in that Texans receiving core and also the one that I would peg with the most long-term upside on the team given his play style and his connection with CJ Stroud. It was very clear through just 10 games played last year that Dell was on his way to being a top 15 fantasy and dynasty wide receiver. He just unfortunately got hurt, and then Houston got a really good deal on Stephon Diggs to make a championship push in 2024. So the receiver room is very, very crowded right now, but Diggs is a free agent next year, so that receiver room could open right back up for Tank Dell to have a really good target share to return to that kind of rookie form that we saw last year. Next up is rookie Brian Thomas Jr., who I'm just completely in on for 2024 and beyond. It's actually kind of scaring me how much I love Brian Thomas Jr. in Jacksonville. The situation is just so extremely perfect for a tremendous rookie season that he can build off of in 2025 that I realistically see a world where Brian Thomas Jr. is the second ranked rookie receiver for Dynasty from this 2024 class, this time next year behind only Marvin Harrison Jr. You heard that right, ahead of Malik Nabers, ahead of Odunze. I think that is a stronger possibility next offseason than most people realize. He has the size, he has the speed, the opportunity, the quarterback, the offensive situation. It's all there for Brian Thomas Jr. to absolutely explode in 2024 and rise up very quickly in our dynasty rankings. But speaking of 2024 explosions, I get those same vibes from George Pickens in the Steelers offense this year, just to a slightly lesser degree than BTJ, because the Steelers offense and quarterback situation is not as good as Jacksonville's, but Pickens has all the talent and opportunity ahead of him as the clear-cut wide receiver one in this offense to post a monstrous 2024 season. Again, there is a realistic world where Pickens sees 130 to 140 or more targets in this offense, and if he gets that type of target share with his talent and his touchdown ability, already coming off an 1,100-yard season with Kenny freaking Pickett, a top 10 fantasy season is not out of the range of possibilities. I love Pickens down here in this range, and I would love to put him higher, but that I think is just a testament to how many good wide receivers there are in the league right now that George Pickens is sitting down here at just wide receiver 24. At wide receiver 25, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, another 2024 hopeful breakout in a new offense that is more conducive to getting three receivers on the field as much as possible and having three receivers produce well over an entire season. There is also the possibility that Jayson takes another step forward in just his overall career development and passes an aging Tyler Lockett on the target totem pole, and then heading into 2025 without Tyler Lockett, that could condense that target share down with just JSN and DK Metcalf. I still believe JSN is every bit the receiver that he was coming out of Ohio State. We just need to get him on the field, and we need him to be completely 100% healthy, and I think the production will follow from there. And then at wide receiver 26, to round out tier 5, I still have Rashee Rice here. I'm holding out hope that everything gets sorted out nicely. Rice gets like a slap on the wrist suspension of like 6 to 8 games, and we just move forward from here with him in a very similar situation still as he had last year as Patrick Mahomes' 1B. Everything that we saw to end the year last year is exactly why I'm still buying into Rashee Rice, because on the field, he was absolutely amazing. 9 targets, over 70 yards and a touchdown every other game were his per game average from week 12 through the Super Bowl. I'm not worried about Hollywood Brown. I'm not worried about Xavier Worthy because they just don't operate the same part of the field as Rashee Rice. So as long as Rashee Rice is healthy and he's on the field and actually playing, it's wheels up for Rashee Rice. All right, to quickly go through tier 6 and 7, let me just list the names that I have in each tier. Starting with tier 6, we have 3 players in Zay Flowers, Xavier Worthy, and Jordan Addison. All very young guys with a whole bunch of upside, but also could get held back by potentially lower target shares to where they do need to rely on either high catch volume, overall efficiency, and or touchdown scoring. And if any of those aren't necessarily there, it may not be all that great, but they're still very young and they still have a ton of upside, so I have to have him here in my top 30. And then tier 7 is just all of the old guys, basically. Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupp, Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, and Stephon Diggs. All of these guys are 28 to 31 years old in age, but also very productive and in good opportunities to continue that production. It's just their age makes it hard to put them up any higher, because why go for a 30-year-old wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 upside when you can get a 24-year-old who's going to do basically the same exact thing? So it doesn't really make any sense to have these guys higher than this because of their age.